Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Carafa, founding Emergence Fellow at Stanford, and I'm introducing our special guest, Krista Donaldson, the founder and CEO of Equalize Health. Equalize Health has launched 5 medical devices in emerging markets to serve underserved communities and close health inequities. Under her leadership, Equalize Health won awards such as the Elevate Prize and was named one of the World Economic Forum Technology Pioneers, as well as one of Fast Company's 50 most innovative companies. Krista, could you please tell us a little bit more about your organization and your work?
Sure, yeah, and Andrea, I have a new computer, so I can actually not show my slides. So I just sent you a link on Google Slides if you wouldn't mind sharing them. But hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you. I'll get started. I'll give a little bit of background around Equalize Health, and then I thought I'd talk a little bit about my background, and then we could talk about the model and like lessons learned and why we exist. And then we can really have as much of a discussion on any of this as you're interested in. But Equalize Health, we are a nonprofit medical device company. We don't just work on devices though. We have a strong design ethos. I'm a Stanford product design grad. A strong ethos around problem solving. So we do products and services, and then we will sometimes get involved, for example, with getting tendering specifications updated with governments. And tendering specifications, if you're not familiar, are when governments make bulk orders and they have like a description of the product and then they send it out there. So we do the products, but then we also do like wraparound and other support. And the purpose is to close healthcare gaps. And our vision is that no matter where you live, you can go to your local hospital and get quality care. There we go, great. I'll start talking about my background a little bit. And sorry, there's a few like builds, so you're gonna have to work with me on that. But anyway, when the slides come up, you'll see on the second slide, I have a picture from when I was in university. But my background is mechanical engineering and loved it. I did an internship at NASA in Huntsville. Thanks. So you can see my NASA badge. A little fun side note is my badge is yellow because I'm Canadian and I had to be escorted even to get to the bathroom. So, and if you could click again, please. I got really excited about alternative spring break. And so you see here in the bottom, ASB, I went to Vanderbilt, but this is where you go and do service projects during your spring break. And I really fell in love with it. And I was really seeking, how can you bring engineering together with serving communities? And to give you a sense of how old I am, there was no Engineers Without Borders when I went through undergrad or any kind of service organizations that allowed us to use our technical skills. On the right, oh, not yet. On the right though, you'll just see I came to Stanford to do product design, and yes, you can go to the next slide. And I was a shop TA at Stanford and fell in love with making things and learning, you know, really the nuts and bolts of how things are made. To me, like that really closed a link, and you know, you have a vision of something like actually being able to create it. And for me, that was very powerful. Next slide, please. So I stayed at Stanford and did a PhD in mechanical engineering, and I looked at how can product development be used to support economic development. And so what you're looking at is a super money maker treadle pump. And this picture is from West Africa, but it's an organization called Kickstart that was started in Nairobi. And I worked for them as an engineer, mostly on manufacturing. But I mention this too, because it's a really exciting product. It would increase smallholder farmers, so like a hectare. It would increase the acreage they could irrigate. It would increase the quality of their crops. And it would also increase the number of growing cycles. So a really great example of a product that is well designed, it suits the local needs, and it helps people earn money, which is why it had the name Super Money Maker. But as working as an engineer, one of the things I learned, and if you go to the next slide, is that it's not just about the thing, it's not just about the product. There's so much more that goes into solving a problem than just the product. And so since there's not very many of us, does anyone know what might be going on in this picture? I'll give you a hint that the metal things in the front are pumps. They're unpainted pumps. Anyone have any idea what we might be doing there?
Fixing the pumps?
Close. We're testing the pump. So with water pumps, you want to do a water test to make sure that there's a seal with the valve. And so you see my colleagues here, and all they were doing all day was testing pumps. And it was a good reminder to me as an engineer, like you can't just think about the thing itself. You have to think about the quality control. Also, there were 70 jigs and fixtures that went into the design of this pump. And then you also have to think like, these things need to be tested and they need to be tested in a quality way, but there's so much more that goes into the development than just the product itself. Next slide, please. While I was in Kenya, my first summer, it was 1998. It was the year of the embassy bombing. And this really, I'll just paint the picture very quickly. So for those of you who have been born since 1998, like this is pre-ISIS world. This is like, we didn't really know about Al-Qaeda. This is when Al-Qaeda came to the forefront. It became part of the public conscience. But the embassy bombing in Nairobi was like Kenya's 9/11, and it was devastating. And being there at the time, we didn't know what was going on. We thought it was a coup at first because there wasn't internet, there wasn't mobile phones. And then just the aftermath was terrible. There were so many people who were injured. And personally, I really felt seeing so many people who were injured and feeling very helpless around health issues. And it got me much more interested in health. It also got me very interested in the link between poverty and extremism, which led to my next job, which I'll just mention very briefly. And I promise all of these tie together. Go to my next slide, please. I took a position with the State Department in Iraq, and this is 2004. So those of you who might remember seeing, there was President Bush who was standing on a ship saying, the war's over, we won, and then things got much worse. And that's right around the time I took my job. But my job was, I was a worker bee, so low on the totem pole at the State Department, and I helped with electricity reconstruction. And it was very challenging. And the reason it was very challenging is because the government treated power plants, which you can see generators in the background of where I'm standing there, they treated them kind of like products, like, oh, we'll fund a bunch of power plants, we'll, make Iraqis happy because there'll be so much power. The reality is it was much more complicated. And you can see in this particular picture, this is with several colleagues of mine from Baghdad at a power plant just south of Baghdad called Dora. But you can see of the 6 stacks, only 2 of them were running. And the reason for that was they couldn't get fuel. And the US government too was also in the building the new power plants, wasn't buying the ones that could run the fuel that was readily available. It needed like a super refined type of fuel that was not available. Next picture or next click, please. This is also from Iraq. One of the things we used to do is fly with the Marines along the power lines. If you imagine power, like, travels on super highways, because it has to go from the power plant to the substation, and then it gets distributed to homes. And you think about the goal of why do we want to produce electricity, right? It's at the end of the day, it was an aspect of bringing stability to the country. It was an aspect of bringing economic opportunities. But at the end of the day, it wasn't about building a power plant. It was about someone being able to flip a switch on, right? And the other thing that the US government didn't plan for, which is a big lesson learned for me, was if you think again about these superhighways coming into Baghdad, there's only 4 of them, power plants. So if you wanted to knock out the power coming into Baghdad, all you had to do was knock down 4 towers like this. And so again, like a lesson coming out of me that really shaped our work at Equalize Health is you have to think about the whole system, which I know is no news to many of you who work in our field, but focusing on power plants and not thinking about the distribution and the transmission of electricity. You don't get someone who can flip on a switch at home and get electricity, which is the end goal. So next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about Equalize Health. I talked a little bit about us in the beginning, but we used to be called DREV, which is short for Design Revolution. And the next slide, please. I mentioned this already, but our goal, no matter where you live, is you can go to your local hospital and confident you or your family will receive affordable and world-class treatment. And one thing I didn't mention when I was talking earlier about us is that our focus is on newborn and maternal health. We've worked in other areas too, but we've decided to focus on newborn and maternal health specifically, at least for the near term. So next slide, please. We are structured as a nonprofit, and we like to say that we operate like, oh, sorry, back one, please. That we operate like a for-profit, but our currency is impact. And I get asked a lot, like, what, you sell medical devices, why don't you just structure yourself as a for-profit or a B Corp? And the reason is because many of the issues that we're tackling are results of market failures. And that's because existing med tech devices, like there's not the margins there in many cases to serve many of the hospitals that, need affordable devices. The other thing too is that we're, as an impact organization, we actually welcome competition. Again, if we want someone to go to a hospital and get treatment, the doctors need to have not a choice of just one medical device like from us, but they need to have choice of lots of affordable medical devices. And whereas if we were a for-profit, we'd be trying to, prevent competition, but we actually really like to see competition of affordable quality devices because it helps us with our mission in closing the gaps. The other reason too, just to give you a sense of our model financially, and happy to, talk more about it, but we take philanthropy for the R&D, the R&D of the product. And then once the product hits the market, then we're looking for economic sustainability. So it allows us to keep the product affordable on the market because we don't have to recoup the R&D and the design costs. All right, now we can go to the next slide. And one last thing I'll just mention to give you a sense of our size. We're 33 people across 4 offices. Our biggest office is New Delhi, India. We have offices, we call them studios, in Nairobi, Kenya, San Francisco, and Seattle. But I want to just tell you a quick story with this photo that you see of a hospital here. It really, I hope, illustrates, why we do what we do. But this is a story of a pediatrician, and you're going to see a photo of him in a minute, but he's in his mid-30s. I call him Dr. Victor, and this is a large public hospital in southern Rwanda. And this Dr. Victor, he was trained in France, and he's exactly what you would want as a pediatrician. He's very earnest, he's very open, and he's just a lovely man. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, thanks. Here he is. His hospital, which you just saw on the last slide, just to give you a sense, it's like on the top of a hill, it's beautiful, but it's a hub of activity. Women are coming from all around to give birth. Families are bringing in their children. And it's the architecture, again, just to give a sense, is like pragmatic and modern at the same time. But let's talk about Dr. Victor. We met him originally when we were setting up a study of one of our products. We have a phototherapy device, which I'm going to talk about briefly in a little bit, but phototherapy is blue light to treat jaundice babies. And the Rwandan government rolled out our device across all of the public referral hospitals. So we were in his hospital to follow up on those devices and to understand their impact. So we got to know him, and he asked us, as he knew more about our type of work, he said, oh, you must work on CPAP. So CPAP is continuous positive air pressure. He says, you need to work on CPAP for premature babies. And just a little side note here, CPAP, the way it works is it holds open babies' lungs when they're not fully developed so that they have enough oxygen and they can survive until they can breathe on their own. But anyway, he said to us, you must work on CPAP to save the premature babies. I have the skills to save these babies. I was trained to save these babies, but we don't have the right tools here. One thing I'll note too is that this was a bit surprising to us when we learned this from him, because there are a lot of CPAPs on the market. In fact, there are even CPAPs, and this is CPAPs again for neonates, but there's CPAPs for COPD for adults, there's CPAPs for newborns, there's even neonatal CPAPs that were designed for low income hospitals. But yet for a variety of reasons, he didn't have access, and we were hearing from our other user and market research that this was still a broad need. So my colleague asked him, how do you care for these babies? And you can click on the next slide, Andrea. He says, we're praying only for these newborns. It is really, really sad. So CPAP, is well understood. We're going to talk about this quiz in a minute, but don't think about that for a sec. But CPAP treats respiratory distress syndrome, and that is the leading cause of death in premature babies worldwide. But if you do have CPAP can save like upwards of 90% of these babies. So we're going to do a quick quiz with all of you. I don't have the setup for voting, so maybe what we could do is people could just say what they think. But when do you think CPAP was introduced for newborns? And it's okay if they're totally wild guesses, because some of you may be medical and some of you may not be. Okay, 1, thank you, Lulu.
Yeah, 1.
1 or 2?
Yeah, 1.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to vote?
3.
Same. Well, you guys are very close. It was 1971, and this is based on a Lancet article. And the point in like even thinking about this is that the solution to save these babies has been around for 50 years, but it hasn't been packaged or, distributed in a way that it reaches hospitals like Dr. Victor's. So next slide, please. I think it's just 1971 is circled. Great. Okay. So to give you a sense of what we've done so far, we've launched 5 products on the market for around neonatal jaundice. We have a prosthetic knee that we launched to, and then we spun off to an organization that focuses on prosthetics. Our first product was launched in late 2012. And we passed a really exciting milestone last year, which was 1 million patients treated. We're actually around 1.5 million patients treated, and that's in 79 countries. Almost all, thanks, Michelle, almost all lower middle income countries, which has been our focus, obviously. And for those of you who like data, the number I really care about is what we call the patients otherwise, which is this 1.2 million in the middle of the bottom, because, when you launch a medical device, of course, it's going to go to some high-end hospitals. And we actually like seeing our products go to the high-end hospitals because that's credibility for other hospitals to want to buy our device. But we're focused again on closing healthcare gaps. So the 1.2 million patients who otherwise would not have received effective treatment is our sign of closing the gap. And then on the right, you see disability adjusted life years, which is just, it's a metric that allows us to track and compare different types of health interventions. And so this is something that the global health community really likes to use. The wonky global health community, not everyone. I'll just mention too that 75% of our impact so far is in India, and we've been expanding. We have a strong presence in East Africa, but we've been expanding more so into West and Southern Africa. And so I'll just mention, while we've been really proud of our success as a global community, I mean, you can even see this with CPAP, and we see this with our work, we feel like it's just not happening fast enough. So it's always exciting to be able to talk to students and others who are affiliated with universities, because you all have so many great ideas and you're thinking in ways that, other people might not have, or we've been group thinking around how to develop medical devices for a long time. So we've been frustrated with the pace, but we also are seeing so many great innovators out there to partner with too. So if you ever have ideas around particularly newborn and maternal health, we're always interested in hearing from you. Next slide though. You got a bit of a preview before. Some of you may have seen this before. This is what we call an equipment graveyard. So this is at a hospital in Western Kenya. But this is where hospitals dump devices that either they can't use or they're broken or any number of reasons. And the WHO estimates that less than 30% of donated medical devices, because there used to be quite a brisk donation model of devices that are no longer used in the US or in Europe being donated to sub-Saharan Africa and other places. But the WHO estimates that less than 30% of donated medical devices is ever turned on at its destination, and as little as 10% actually ever becomes fully operable. This is important too, because I don't think it's a surprise to anyone who has a design background, right? Like a device that's designed for a high-income hospital at Stanford, for example, is that same device is not going to work necessarily in an environment where there's voltage surges or there's not enough nurses or any number of reasons. In some cases too, we've seen donated devices that aren't even rated for the right voltage. So, they have the American plugs and they have the American voltage rating, but yet they're expected to work in a place where the plugs don't match, and it's the higher voltage. In terms of like how the community thinks about solving the problem, how we've seen the community think about solving the problem of medical devices too, is what we've largely seen, and I alluded to this earlier, but taking a device that's already on the market, again, targeting high-income hospitals, and then defeaturing it. So, taking out all the bells and whistles, and then packaging it to be sold in low-income markets. And that's a very common approach. And so you do see more affordable devices, and sometimes those are quality devices. But again, it's a mismatch between the context in like a Stanford style hospital and a hospital that might be a public facility, in a rural area of India that doesn't have all the resources or the infrastructure. And often people think affordability is the key problem, and it is a problem, but as you can tell, what I'm getting at is actually its usability issues. One thing that's nice about medical devices as compared to farming equipment from my Kickstart days is that hospitals generally have a similar culture and similar protocols that trickle down from the WHO and other government agencies. Whereas with farming equipment, it's quite different, whether you have salinity or you're growing tomatoes, or what cultural practices might be about leaving a pump in the field. So an exciting thing about med devices to us, and we work on problems that are global in scale, is that you have to obviously be conscious of cultures and needs in different contexts, but they're not radically different. Like a hospital, even Stanford versus rural India, like there's a desire to be able to do the very best care and similar protocols. The challenge is in that rural hospital in India, they may not have a device that works. Oh, great. You've clicked on. That's great. So I thought what I do is share a few examples of some design insights from our work to give you a sense of how we do our user research and then how we apply that to product development. I estimate that our staff, so that's the it's not a real we, it's our staff, I estimate we're probably in about 300 to 400 hospitals a year. And this is doing user research, it's meeting with officials, but it's always, observation and understanding what the conditions are. And we take great care in this, because it's not just understanding, what the design constraints are and what the design opportunities are, but it's also seeing how things change over time. And an example of that, is, for example, in several Indian states, there's more data that's being collected around newborn health outcomes, which is really exciting because it allows those hospitals to be able to target where improvements need to be made. And that helps us because then we can see where the priorities of different facilities are. The example, though, that you're looking at, this is a photo of Brilliance, our phototherapy device that I mentioned earlier. And, to give you a bit more of a sense about jaundice, if you're not already familiar, but about 12% of all babies need to be treated for jaundice. And if they're not treated, and they're not treated quickly, because it's time sensitive, it can lead to brain damage or even death. And the brain damage is not well understood by the medical community. They know that it can be linked to cerebral palsy. They believe it's linked to deafness, but they don't actually understand the low grade brain damage. And one of our advisors is at Stanford is Dr. Vinod Bhutani, and he says it could even be linked, for example, to learning disabilities, but it's not well understood. When we did our initial research, and we started on this project because my colleague was talking with an Indian doctor who told us that he was placing babies out in the sun to get treatment. And those of us who've had kids in the US who are like slightly jaundiced, the doctor often says, like, go stick them in the sun or stick them by the window. And that's great for low grade, but the blue light is actually what breaks down the bilirubin in the blood so the babies can pee it out. And that's what you need when you have hyperbilirubinemia or severe jaundice. At the time when we were doing our research around Brilliance, and this is like 2010, 2011, 2012, affordability was a key constraint around phototherapy devices. To purchase a new device, if we were buying one in California, it would be about $3,500 US to like $5,000, but actually it was much more if you were buying one in Nairobi or Manila or Delhi, and we would see prices as high as $10,000. The thing that was really interesting, though, as we dug in, is it wasn't just the purchasing price of the device, but also the cost, and this is of existing devices on the market, but also the cost of the replacement bulbs. Andrea, if you don't mind going to the next slide. What we saw as we dug into the problem more is that a typical phototherapy device at the time, and you see this one uses the tube bulbs, the fluorescent tube bulbs, but those bulbs needed to be replaced every 3 to 6 months, and they cost anywhere from $23 each in Delhi to $185 in Kampala, Uganda. And so you can imagine this adds up very quickly. And so what we would see is hospitals like this one, and this is a specialty hospital in southern India, and a specialty pediatrics hospital, and they didn't have the medical grade blue bulbs, and they couldn't afford them, or they had supply chain problems, so they'd replace them with white bulbs, and which is not intense enough to be effective treatment. And you can see here, even some of the bulbs are burned out. So that was a really interesting insight for us. And we were lucky at the time, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is that there was huge advances in LED technology. Blue LEDs, stop me if you guys know this, but blue was the last LED that was developed. In fact, I think it was 2014, the Physics Nobel Prize went to the developers of the blue LEDs. And at the same time, there was great advances in manufacturing blue LEDs, which we were kind of in the right place at the right time. And LEDs, are very long lasting. In our case, they last at least 7 years. And that's like if you're using them all the time. And even then, like they drop in intensity a little bit. So you can just crank up the power and keep that intensity. So we were able to capitalize on that, do the LEDs so that we could get rid of this operating cost problem and this problem of like having to get like medical grade bulbs at least twice a year. And that insight led to our usage of the LEDs and lenses too. Okay, we'll go to the next one. This is example number 2 of interesting design insights. And like phototherapy, many of the CPAPs, so we're going to talk about CPAPs again, are prohibitively expensive. And what you see in many hospitals is what we call homemade CPAP devices. And so the pictures you see here are 2 examples of homemade bubble CPAPs. And the way it works is that a tube goes into the water, and that's what sets the pressure that's delivered to the baby's lung. So on the left lungs. And so on the left-hand side, actually that drainage bag is being used as the bubble CPAP. And then on the right, you can see an old water bottle. And from a design standpoint, particularly for us, when we see clinicians making their own, like they're designing or jerry-rigging their own devices, it's a real sign of needs. So we started to dig into this problem, and we wanted to understand why, if there's so many CPAPs on the market, were they not getting picked up? And again, part of it was affordability, but the main issue was usability. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. So what we learned was that NICUs, neonatal intensive care units, the nurses were so overwhelmed. And so a NICU here in the US, you would have 1 nurse per 2 babies. I think you can at max have 1 nurse per 3 babies. Often it's 1 nurse per baby in a NICU. But what we were seeing in our target market, so again, India, the East African countries, and some places we assessed in Southeast Asia, we were seeing an average of 1 nurse per 8 babies. So you have to imagine this poor overburdened nurse having to make decisions about which alarm to respond to, how to, just manage all the different things going on with these critically sick babies. And so you can imagine now too, that the idea of taking a device that's designed for, a Stanford, which assumes that you've got a nurse hovering around, defeaturing it and then sending it to India is going to work in that environment. And what we see is it doesn't. And even when hospitals do have devices, they're often not in use for a number of reasons. Next slide, please. One of the reasons why we see CPAPs, well, a couple of reasons I'll just mention too, we see CPAPs not in use, and this is a rendering of our device, and it'll be coming to market later next year. But one of the things we saw, well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the things we saw is that there's high nurse turnover. So many nurses get burned out, or they'll go on rotation, or they get a better offer. And what you'll see is that, a medical device company or a distributor will come in and train everybody on how to use a CPAP. And then of course the nurse goes to a new rotation or a new job, and there's someone now using it who doesn't know how to use it and often doesn't feel confident delivering care. And so our device, for example, one of the things we designed as part of the startup screen, like how to hook it all up, and like a little mini tutorial for nurses that shows them how to use it. And of course you can bypass that if you know how to do it. But, this idea of being able to have a picture-based tutorials to catch nurses who were not part of the training. Another barrier we saw too was that most CPAPs use proprietary consumables, like the cannula that goes up the nose and the tubes that go, they'll use proprietary ones that work only with their device. And as you can guess, they're very expensive. That's part of their financial model. But what ends up happening is you have a hospital, for example, in Tanzania, and it's got 3 different CPAP devices because some of them have been, maybe 2 of them have been donated and one of them the government purchased, and they need 3 different sets of consumables and they don't have the right ones, or they don't have the right sizes. And as a result, the device doesn't get used. And so our device can be used with almost any type of consumable. All right, next slide, please. This last example I just wanted to tell you about, because it's not a product, it's a service. And you're, actually, could you go back 1 slide? I think, there we go. Okay, this is Dr. Kumar. Several years ago, we had some research money from USAID. And the question we were trying to get answered is, as devices, particularly phototherapy devices, are becoming more available, particularly in areas outside of major cities, why is adoption a bit slow? If it's a well-designed product and it's affordable. And we had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Kumar, and he is an incredible pediatrician who, when he talked about his background, he graduated top of his medical school class, he returned to his hometown, and he set up a private practice. And to give you a sense of his private practice, it's a small hospital. We call them micro hospitals, but the first floor is this small hospital that's maybe the size of a classroom, subdivided into rooms, and then he lives up above. But we asked him why, he treats kids, he treats newborns, he treats older kids, but we asked about why doctors were referring babies with jaundice to the regional hospital, which was already overcrowded, when they could treat them at clinics like his. And he said, sometimes it's just easier. Sometimes the parents don't pay. Sometimes he talked about all of these challenges, and it just kind of, from the end, you could tell it wasn't worth it for him. He was just going to refer. And we heard that, and we also heard from other doctors, not him, because he was an expert. We heard from other doctors how they didn't feel confident in their ability to dose. And so, of course, with phototherapy, it's light, so dosing light. As a result, we introduced, if you go to the next slide, we introduced a telementoring program, and the telementoring program had two aims. One was to build a community of practice. So, what Dr. Kumar was talking about, or he talked about with his colleagues, or it's just easier to refer. Really, it was kind of an issue of low morale. Doctors were telling us that their patients' parents refuse to pay sometimes, and the doctor's been up all night trying to take care of a kid or several kids, and it's just it's such a bummer. And so on the one hand, it was to build a community of practice, but so doctors can share these issues and talk about things and share strategies around things that are important to them. And then the second was to provide continuing education for those who are interested. So these telementoring programs are done at a state level, and they're taught by a local expert in a local language, and we do all the facilitation on the back end. And the topics, they're all case-based. There's one a week for 6 or 7 weeks. They're an hour each. And each session, they'll talk about it. The doctors will talk about a case, and they'll take turns presenting it, and then they'll talk about how they would handle it. But we've seen really great outcomes in terms of doctors feeling more connected and being able to share information. And in a case where we've done this with nurses in an Indian state, Chhattisgarh, we're also seeing that they're WhatsApping each other to get advice on different patients, which is meeting our goals. We hope to do a study that connects all of this to health outcomes, but we haven't done that yet. All right, next slide, please. So just to wrap up here, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the philanthropy side. One of the challenges we have in our sector is that, to raise money for global health projects, it's kind of you have to have an idea, like we talk about at Stanford, you have this great idea and you have this great pitch, but to even get there, as many of you know, you have to do a lot of work, and ideally you're doing a lot of user research. So we've done all this work, kind of with these little grants, along the way, and a few bigger grants, but we've been raising a catalytic fund. And the catalytic fund allows us to do 10 projects in short order, which in turn enables us to increase our revenues to be more self-sustaining. And I do mention that because one of the challenges of philanthropy is very fickle. And sometimes it's fickle for a good reason, like when we have a COVID pandemic, and sometimes it's fickle for a bad reason because there's someone new who comes in and an organization totally changes, or a funder totally changes its strategy. So our goal is to raise this fund to 15 million. We raised 2.1 already, and we will be able to have a lot more impact sooner. So our goal is to 5 million patients by 2025. Next slide, please. One thing I just thought might be of interest to you guys is that we have a small and growing community around design in global health or public health. And there was a special issue of global health science and practice that's focused on design and health. And I mention this because I was a co-author on a paper with several amazing colleagues, one in India, one in Kenya, actually 2 in Kenya, although one of them's moved to Portugal. But we looked at what's next in design for global health. And we talked about a number of things, but one of them, which I think you talk about, which I think is a good fit for Emergence, but is moving away from user-centered design to life-centered design, where you're taking into account not just users and markets, but planet and climate change and everything else, and having more of a holistic approach to design research. And so that's actually one of the things we talk about in what's next. All right, my last slide is next. Thanks, Andrea. I thought it would be nice to end just with a quote, and Dr. Dilama Zumu is the former head of the African Union, but she said, it's important to understand that development is not a nice to have. It is essential for peace, for stability, and for progress in the world. With that, I'll stop. And if you guys have any questions.
Thank you so much, Krista. This was incredibly interesting. And I think the final quote is just spot on. Michelle, I see you're clapping for that. Do you also have a question, or is?
Yeah, no, that was amazing. And I just, I love user-centered design, and just some of the, and also how you're thinking about funding and kind of safeguarding for funding through the catalytic, am I saying it right?
Yeah,
Fund.
catalytic fund. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yep. So one thing that we talk about with students in our class often, and is core to kind of how we have them look at these problem areas, is through this identification of unmet needs before you even think about solutions. Yeah. And in a lot of your examples, it sounds like this is the kind of work you all do. How do you kind of systematically do that? How does your organization systematically look for unmet needs?
Yeah, so that's something that we've also refined over time, and I think we will continue to iterate. But the way we start is we first, identify the problem, and we prefer problems that are identified by frontline workers. And so that could be a doctor or a nurse or a midwife or a repair person. We love repair people because they know all the things that are wrong. It could be supply chain related, government official, like you name it. But we're really looking for understanding the problem by the people who are dealing with the problems. That's not to say that we don't hear about problems from other places, but we really prefer the ones that come from obviously the people who are experiencing them. At that point, we do we do gated research, which is very typical in medical devices and much product design, but we have to have better certainty about the product to continue to invest in, or the solution, because sometimes it's a service. But to give you a sense, a problem's been identified, and then we seek to better understand the problem. Is this a local problem? Is this a global problem? Because we work on problems that are global in scale. Is it something we can solve? We look at a number of things. We look at the potential impact. We look at time to market, and is this something that we can do within the budget we have? And then if it meets those initial requirements, then we will really start to invest more. And we're always doing user research along the way. And we're asking for feedback from experts, and we're trying to find experts if it's a new area. I mentioned Dr. Vinod Bhutani, but he was really instrumental in helping us understand the problem, both clinically, but also making introductions to other key opinion leaders who, could also inform our work. But then, like, to your point, we as we move further along, it's like, what's the regulatory burden? Who's going to be our potential commercial partner when we do pick up a problem to work on, and we've invested in understanding? The first thing we also do is look for who's already done great innovation. And so we're working on some postpartum hemorrhage work. We're partnered with a South African OB gynecologist who had several concepts around both the screening and the treatment, which is really exciting. And he's got, he's a doctor who's dedicated his life. He's in his 70s to saving women's lives. And, he had several concepts, but he can't bring them to market. And we have a team that can do the design, it can do the regulatory, and it can do all the steps that are needed for regulatory. I'll just mention too, I alluded to this, but we seek commercial partners that can scale our product into the markets, because we're a small group. We're not going to do distribution. So we will do vetting on distributors, but we really like working through commercial actors who serve our markets, and then making sure we have alignment and incentivize them to sell to hospitals that they might not otherwise.
Yeah. Okay. So that was the follow-on question I was to have. How do you incent those commercial partners? Because you're mission-based, and then also how do you price on the commercialization side? Because again, it's a mission-based organization.
Yeah. So when we partner commercially, we are very clear we don't want it to be a CSR. It's got to be a proper corporate partnership, because we have to have alignment. And so I'll start with your pricing question first. We do a lot of research, like as part of like the early design, like, can we design something that's going to hit the affordability that's needed to solve this problem? And so sometimes it's no, like we can't do it, or the impact for the cost of the project, we just can't, we're not the right ones to do it. But with our partners, we partnered with Phoenix Medical Systems, which is a Chennai, India-based group for our phototherapy. They very well respected in India. And we actually found them because when we were doing our user research, we would say to doctors, like, which devices do you like? Which companies respond to your servicing calls the fastest? Who do you like? Who do you wish was better? Like the very kind of typical Stanford questions. And that led us to Phoenix. And they've, they're a smaller Indian group, but they were very eager to expand their footprint, and they started serving the sub-Saharan African markets with our product and some of their other products. With a bigger commercial actor, we're partnered with Draper on our CPAP. So Draper is a big, for those of you who aren't familiar, a big med tech company out of Germany. It's like similar size to Medtronic. But they're very interested in moving into emerging markets. They see the future of growth there. And then in that case, it's, matching up their knowledge and skills with our ability to support them as they're moving into those markets. And some people say, oh, well, you're just helping a for-profit company. And I see it as we are helping build sustainability for our work, and not just for our products, but hopefully for others at Draper, and others are going to move into these markets, which goes back to like, we're looking to really seek to build competition as compared to eliminating it.
Yeah. And the reality is you couldn't get the distribution that the world needs without some of this help. So yeah, that's amazing. That's so inspiring.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting to me is, like, as someone who did not grow up in global health, there has always been a bit of, like, as an observer, I'll just say, there's been a bit of a tension between the academic community and the commercial community. And that was something that we've really tried to bring together, because we absolutely need the academic community, because that's where a lot of discovery is happening, a lot of great ideas. But on the commercial side, like, that's how you get solutions to people. And they're often the ones who are, willing to take some risk and, calculated risk, obviously, in serving markets and investment. So we've worked very hard to, like, bring different actors together and, structure things so that the companies get what they need. They're not going to get the margins they're used to, but they'll get some margins, and we can bring some of these great ideas from academia to the world.
Yeah, mutually beneficial.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome.
So
A lot of matchmaking.
Going back to how you identify unmet needs, one of the areas that we are actually tackling right now in our class is looking for adjacent needs that maybe are not really related to the problem you want to solve, but will help you have the user buy in and either purchase the product or use it. How in your experience you can not only identify the connection between an adjacent need and another unmet need that you're trying to address, but also how do you connect them in the way you design your solution?
Yeah, so I like how you're thinking about it. So what we do is, like, we will develop a solution, and then we follow our product. So most product groups on the for-profit side, obviously they track sales, and they know where the sales are happening, and there's, like, follow-up with servicing and everything. In the nonprofit sector, there isn't a lot of tracking of devices. We track them. And the reason I mention this is because when you track something you've developed, you see all the adjacencies that you have not figured out and where things are going wrong. And so one of the things, like, I always tell our team is just plan on a V2 from the beginning. Like, no matter how good our user research is and, like, how much we notice along the way, whether that is, there isn't service engineers to replace fuses, and, a lot of them are getting blown. Like, we can design for that in the product, but some of it just, like, you need a service engineer for. And that knowledge we can start to address either with the design or in negotiations with our commercial partners to say, like, these regions are going to need more help because we're noticing that the supply chains are broken. But I think, to answer your question is, like, follow your product so you can figure out where the blocks and where the barriers are. And then you can address them with, like, telementoring or other types of approaches. And then, just always being aware of how things are changing and where things go wrong.
That's incredibly useful. Our students don't have a product yet. So they're at a stage where they're trying to identify the right unmet need. And so I wonder if there's kind of process that you've used in the past where in order to have the user use your solution and in order to really solve the problem that you want to solve, you really need to find a totally different unmet need in a totally different area, and that will help you not only develop a solution that people will use, but also solve the problem at scale. Is there anything that you've done in early stage research that helped you identify this kind of adjacent needs?
Yeah, I have to think about that. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about too when you asked the question originally is, we try very hard to not be too focused on a problem going in. It's being very open to what we learn from the users. And sometimes we'll end up working on something different than we thought we were going to originally. And even when we don't work on things, it's so interesting, right? Like in terms of setting context. And just to give you a sense, one time I was in a hospital in Kenya and it was a Sunday and it was pretty quiet. And from when we're doing user research, that's actually kind of nice because then you don't feel like you're disrupting what's going on. But I looked over, I was chatting with the nurse and I looked over and there was maybe 50 to 60 little pieces of tape stuck to the wall, but just so one end was stuck and the other was, and I said to her, I said, can you tell me what's going on here? And she said, we're so busy on Mondays. Nobody comes in on Sundays, but we're so busy on Monday, we don't even have time to cut the tape. And so what they were doing was preparing for the next day because they had a little bit of quiet time before the Monday rush. And yes, patients come in some days more than others. And that's a learning, but it was such an interesting learning for me because even though I was in this very quiet NICU, and I was only visiting this once, I was getting a glimpse of a challenge that this hospital was seeing. And it goes back to, again, the data we learned later with our CPAP research was there's just not enough nurses for babies many days. And that affects no matter what design problem we're working on or what device or what service, it's a learning that we have to integrate into designing the solution.
So you mentioned also, and Lulu, let us know, please, if you have any questions.
Yes.
I'll let you ask the question if you have.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Krista. And I'm from MSX, and I've been working for the healthcare company for over 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah, both sold equipment and the medical device.
Great.
So I quite resonate with a lot of things you talk about, those wasted equipment in the backyard. I saw that a lot in the hospitals, in the garage, because some might missing some spare parts, or also because surgeons don't know how to operate those equipments. Yeah, those are many reasons. And I want to talk more about those adoption rates you mentioned about. There is technique here, and why the surgeons won't adopt that. And I have been encountered that too, because I work for Johnson & Johnson, and we provide, every year we launch new product that aim to make surgeons to do easy of use and the safer, blah blah. But as a marketing head, I always tell our surgeons that we have more options. Like we have the cutting edge technology, but we also have the very simple technology, cheaper. Like you can just use a suture and to treat the patients, and with low cost. That's for the patients who can't afford the very fancy products. But same as you said, that adoption rate is very low, and because the surgeons feels like just using sutures, require more skills, and usually those hospitals located in the countryside or in the poor side, and the surgeons are not very skilled to perform those suture technology. But in the very big hospitals, and the surgeons, they can do that, but they don't want to do that because they want to do it, quicker and safer and faster. That's the problem. So I just want to ask your opinion about this side.
Yeah. Well, I want to pick up on something you said that I really appreciate, and I don't want to lose, and that's you need a range of solutions. And I see to solve a problem. And I think there's this tendency, I think it's a little bit like tech sector, like magic bullet, unicorn sort of thing, like it's going to solve a problem. But what you talked about and what we see is that you often need multiple solutions or versions of a product or solution to actually, give options to doctors to address the issue. What you're talking about though, particularly with the rural doctors, is why we launched the telementoring. A lot of them just told us like they weren't confident. And so they would refer babies or refer patients because they weren't confident in providing treatment that they should be able to provide. And by should, I mean, they've been trained. There's no comorbidities that need to be managed at a higher level facility, sorts of things like that. And, and when, in the cases of babies, when they're referred on, like any patient, when they're referred on to another facility, particularly an overcrowded one, the risk really increases. And so the telementoring is one way we've managed that. One of the other things that we're seeing is, and I'm sure you know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, but we really do hear that even the rural doctors, like they want to have endorsements from other doctors because there's very low trust in many of our markets. So when we would do research around like, oh, how do you decide to use this technique or this product? Often we'll hear something like, oh, I talked to my friend who's in the next town over and he's recommended like this device or this procedure. And we'll talk to that doctor and we'll be like, how did you decide to do this? And they're like, oh, in the major city, I have someone I went to medical school with, I talked to them. And then it's like, you can trace these folks up to like these key opinion leaders. And I think that's also really interesting too. And I do wonder that, in addition to telementoring, is there ways that we in this field can better recognize and leverage those, those channels of credibility?
Yes, I agree. I think one of the reasons that cause these channels is because the companies like Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic, they spend a lot of money from their profit to train their doctors to adopt their products. So what are you gonna do for this part, how to train?
We build that into our model. Yeah, we do build that into the model with our work. It might not look exactly like high end the way, J&J might do it in some of our other big company peers. But it might be, for example, on Zoom, or it might be a combination of like training being built into the device, like I was talking about with our CPAP. Our goal is to be able to meet all of those needs. We might just not do it the same way, and probably we'll do it more affordably. We have to do it more affordably because our margins are much thinner.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Thanks for the comments and the questions.
So it's 6:30, Krista. We don't want to take any more of your time. I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for sharing your stories and insights. This was incredibly interesting, and we'll definitely have an event just for viewing this with our students. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your questions, and thank you for the applause. I appreciate all of you. Thank you.